Story Number 1 Dosimeter Audit. I arrived at the Idaho National Laboratory Experimental Reactor Facility on a Tuesday morning in late March. The drive from Boise took 3 hours. I had completed the quarterly radiation safety compliance review at this site 4 times before, and the routine was familiar enough that I could have navigated it without the facility map they gave me at the security checkpoint. The initial walkthrough of the primary containment structure proceeded normally. I checked the seals on the main vessel, verified the cooling system pressures, and logged the background radiation readings in subsections A through C6. The facility was operating within all documented parameters. The shift supervisor, a man named Garrett, walked with me for the first 2 hours, then returned to the control room to manage the afternoon shift change. I reached subsection C7 at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. My dosimeter registered a localized spike as I approached the access hatch. The reading was inconsistent with the reactor's documented output levels. The spike was small, nothing that would trigger an automatic alert, but it was there. I noted it and continued my approach. I followed standard protocol and requested that Garrett provide the maintenance logs for subsection C7. I radioed the control room and waited. Garrett's response came back within 2 minutes. He stated that subsection C7 had been sealed and decommissioned 8 months prior following a coolant leak. The section was no longer part of the active facility. There would be no logs because there was no operation. I confirmed the information and approached the access hatch. The seal appeared intact from the outside. I opened it anyway. The interior chamber was fully operational. All equipment was running. The cooling systems were circulating. The control panels displayed active readouts. The lights were on. There was no dust. There was no corrosion. There was no evidence that this section had been sealed for 8 months or for any length of time. I stepped inside and let the hatch close behind me. My dosimeter continued its steady climb. I observed a figure in protective gear moving between the control panels. The suit was heavy and outdated, the kind with the external radio pack mounted on the shoulder. The figure was performing what appeared to be standard monitoring procedures. Reading gauges, adjusting valves, making notations on a clipboard. The movements were deliberate and practiced. I called out. The figure did not acknowledge me. I called out again. The figure continued working. I attempted to radio the control room. The communication failed. I tried my backup radio. It produced only static. My dosimeter reading began climbing beyond safe exposure limits, despite my distance from any active radiation source. The reading did not make sense. There was nothing between me and the figure that could account for the escalation. I made the decision to engage the emergency containment lockdown for subsection C7 without authorization from the facility director. I moved to the manual override panel and activated the sequence. The hatch sealed. The interior ventilation system shifted to isolation mode. I marked the exterior hatch with a level 4 contamination warning placard and returned to the control room. Garrett was waiting for me. He asked why I had sealed C7. I told him what I had found. He said that was not possible. I told him I had been inside the section. He said I could not have been inside the section because the hatch had been welded shut 8 months ago. I looked at my dosimeter. The reading had stopped climbing. It was now descending slowly, as if the exposure event had ended. The post-incident review was conducted 3 days later by a team from the Department of Energy. They found no operational equipment in subsection C7. They found no radiation above background levels. They found no record of my dosimeter alert in the facility's monitoring system. The hatch was still sealed. When they opened it, the interior was empty concrete walls and rusted pipe fixtures. The section was exactly as it should have been: decommissioned, abandoned, and inert. My dosimeter readings for that day were reviewed. The spike I had recorded at 2 o'clock in the afternoon did not appear in any of the facility's backup systems. My backup radio had been tested and functioned normally. There was no explanation for the static I reported hearing. I was reassigned to desk-based compliance documentation review at the regional office in Boise. The reassignment was framed as a lateral move, not a disciplinary action. I was told the change would allow me to focus on broader facility assessments rather than on-site inspections. I accepted the reassignment without objection. Subsection C-7 was filled with concrete and removed from all facility diagrams. The cost of the remediation was absorbed into the facility's standard maintenance budget. No external report was filed. No incident summary was distributed to other laboratories. I have since learned that the figure I observed was wearing a radiation suit style that was discontinued in 1973. The suit design was distinctive enough that I was able to identify it through archived procurement records. In 1973, a technician named Walter Drummond was killed in subsection C-7 during an uncontrolled reaction event. The event was never publicly reported. The section was sealed immediately and remained sealed for 51 years until my visit. I have not returned to the Idaho National Laboratory facility. My reassignment to the Boise office has been made permanent. The incident has been archived and classified. No further investigation is authorized or expected. Story number 2, Tunnel Marker 8. I was assigned to conduct a structural integrity assessment of the abandoned Michigan Central Station subway extension beneath downtown Detroit. The extension had been sealed since 1973 following budget cuts, and my task was straightforward: document hazardous materials, confirm the tunnels were empty, and clear the site for explosive placement. Demolition was scheduled for 6 weeks out. I had completed similar assessments on 4 other abandoned transit systems in the region. The work was routine. I descended through the Washington Boulevard access shaft at 10:45 in the morning. The shaft was concrete, narrow, and still intact. My equipment was standard hardhat camera, air quality monitor, structural laser scanner, and a radio with a fresh battery. The air temperature at ground level was 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The sealed tunnel entrance was exactly where the 1971 construction blueprints indicated it would be. I began documentation at 1100 hours. The main tunnel ran north-south beneath Michigan Avenue for approximately 2,400 feet. The walls showed water damage consistent with decades of groundwater seepage, but the structural integrity appeared sound. The concrete had not fractured. The steel reinforcement was visible but not compromised. I moved methodically, recording measurements and taking photographs at regular intervals. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I discovered passages that did not appear on any official record. They branched to the south, perpendicular to the main tunnel, and they were finished, not rough excavation, finished. The walls were smooth concrete. The floor was level. The dimensions were consistent with the main tunnel. I checked the blueprints again. Nothing, no notation, no amendment, no record of their construction. I documented the discovery and attempted to contact my supervisor via radio. The signal was dead. I was approximately 800 feet from the access shaft, well within the rated range of the equipment. I checked the frequency. Correct. I tried again. Nothing. The radio showed full battery and no error indicators. It simply would not transmit or receive. I continued into the southern passages. The air quality monitor registered temperature fluctuations of 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit within seconds. This was not possible in a sealed, stable environment. Temperature changes of that magnitude occur over hours in underground spaces, not in the span of time it took me to walk forward. The monitor showed no malfunction. The readings were consistent across multiple measurements. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, I encountered a section of tunnel where my headlamp beam would not penetrate beyond approximately 10 feet. The darkness ahead was not absolute in the sense of an absence of light. It was something else. My beam ended. It did not fade into shadow. It ended as though there was a boundary. I stood at that boundary for several minutes. I documented it. I attempted to move forward. Standard protocol required immediate withdrawal and supervisor notification at this point. I should have returned to the access shaft. The situation had exceeded my authorized scope of assessment. I continued forward instead. I moved into the darkness. My headlamp remained useless beyond 10 feet. I used the laser scanner to measure distance. The scanner worked. It indicated the tunnel continued for another 300 feet before terminating. I walked that distance. The darkness did not change. The temperature fluctuations continued. My air quality monitor was now registering readings that did not correspond to any standard atmospheric composition, though the oxygen levels remained adequate. I heard rhythmic mechanical sounds at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon. The sounds were consistent with pre-1950s rail equipment. Specifically, the sounds resembled the operational cycle of a rail brake system and the grinding of metal wheels on track. All tracks had been removed from this extension during the 1970 forced salvage operation. I documented the sounds on my hardhat camera. The audio was clear on playback. My equipment began failing simultaneously at approximately 3 o'clock. The laser scanner lost calibration. The air quality monitor ceased registering. The hardhat camera's recording light went dark. The radio, which had been dead for nearly 2 hours, suddenly emitted a brief burst of static and then resumed silence. I withdrew immediately. I reached the access shaft at 3:25 in the afternoon. I ascended and surfaced at 3:35. The site supervisor was waiting at the ground level entrance. He informed me that I had been underground for 4 hours and 50 minutes. My internal chronology accounted for only 90 minutes. The site was reclassified within 48 hours as a contaminated groundwater hazard. The contamination report cited elevated levels of metallic compounds in the soil surrounding the southern passages. No explanation was provided for the source of the contamination. Demolition was postponed indefinitely pending further environmental assessment. I was reassigned to surface level municipal projects. My access to the subway extension was revoked. The assessment documentation I submitted was filed under restricted classification. I was informed that the site would be monitored by contracted environmental specialists and that no further personnel assessment was required. The file remains open. I have not returned to the site. I have not been asked to return. The incident has been archived and reassigned to a different department. My involvement concluded with my written report. Story number 3, Forestry Permit 19. I arrived at the permitted tract on the morning of October 18th under clear skies. The kind of autumn day where the forest smells like rot and resin in equal measure. The tract lay approximately 40 miles from the nearest district office, which was standard for this level of operation. My assignment was straightforward: verify boundary markers, check the harvest volume against the approved cutting plan, and document any deviations. I had done this work for 12 years across the Pacific Northwest, and the routine had become automatic enough that I could run the checklist while thinking about other things. The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the absence of sound. The forest is never silent, but the absence of human activity. The logging crew had been scheduled to work through October. According to the equipment time logs recorded on the main excavator, the crew had departed 6 days prior. All machinery sat in place. The fuel tanks were full. A thermos of coffee sat on the table inside the crew trailer, still warm enough that condensation clung to the interior walls. I documented the discrepancy in my field notebook and began walking the harvest perimeter. The western boundary markers should have formed a clear line between permitted and protected stands. Instead, I found them removed and stacked in a deliberate arrangement pointing deeper into the old growth. The markers formed an arrow, roughly 200 feet long, constructed with the kind of precision that suggested intent rather than accident. The protected zone beyond the boundary had not been marked for harvest. It was dense, old-growth forest, Douglas fir and western red cedar, some of the trees older than the logging company itself. Protocol required me to report the boundary violation immediately. I tried the radio first. Static answered, but not the usual white noise. This was rhythmic, pulsing like breathing. I waited for it to clear. It did not. I tried the satellite phone. Same pattern. The static rose and fell in intervals I could almost count. I followed the marker line into the old growth for approximately half a mile. The forest here was darker, the canopy thick enough that afternoon light came down in thin columns. That was when I found the trees. They had been cut and delimbed, but not by any equipment in the crew trailer. The wood was separated along the grain as if pulled apart rather than sawn. There were no saw marks, no impact scoring from equipment, no evidence of the mechanical violence that characterizes modern timber harvest. The trees lay in neat rows, branches removed with the same pulled-apart separation. I stood among them and understood that I was looking at something outside my training to interpret. I made notes. I took photographs. I did not speculate. At 1700 hours, I returned to the crew trailer and attempted the radio again. The static resolved briefly into clarity. I heard logging crew chatter, voices discussing stand density measurements for the exact trees I had documented in the old growth. The measurements matched my own survey notes from earlier that day. The voices used my cadence, my phrasing, my specific vocabulary for timber assessment. The transmission lasted approximately 90 seconds before dissolving back into rhythmic static. I remained inside the crew trailer until dawn. Throughout the night, I heard footsteps circling the structure, slow and methodical. I heard diesel equipment running outside, the sound of an excavator moving through the forest. When I looked through the window, I saw only darkness and stationary machines. The equipment had not moved. The sounds continued until first light, then stopped. On day 3, I hiked back to my vehicle without further radio attempts. The access road was blocked by a single massive cedar trunk that had not been present during my approach. The wood grain was separated in the same pulled, apart pattern I had documented in the old growth. I did not attempt to move it. I hiked out through the forest instead, a longer route that took most of the day. I submitted my report 2 days later. I cited abandoned equipment, permit violations, and unauthorized access to protected stands. I recommended the permit holder be fined. I omitted all observations beyond the western boundary. The boundary violation was sufficient justification for administrative action. The other details did not require documentation. The tract was reclassified as administratively closed pending environmental review. The logging company dissolved 3 weeks later for unrelated financial irregularities, accounting discrepancies that predated my inspection. The permit was not reissued. I was reassigned to Eastern Washington District offices effective January 1st of the following year. My supervisor cited the need for experienced personnel in the drier regions. I did not request reconsideration. I have completed 8 more years of permit verifications in the Eastern Districts without incident. My field reports are thorough and precise. I do not return to the Olympic National Forest. The incident was formally closed and archived under standard administrative procedures on November 4th, 2024.